Welcome to Pax Britannica. Season 3, Episode 29, Radicalism of the Soul. Welcome back to Pax Britannica. I'm your host, Dr. Samuel Hume. Before we begin today, we have new members of the House of Lords. Earl Shaked, Dan McKinley is now Earl of Callendar, and Mike Baron Mortyn. All patrons get their own premium RSS feed to let them listen to the podcast without ads. Go to patreon.com/PaxBritannica to find out more. Last time, we saw Oliver Cromwell dissolve the Rump Parliament of the Commonwealth of England. Months, years of delaying reforms and new elections had worn his patience thin, but it finally appeared that Parliament was going to set in motion new elections, overseen by a responsible caretaker government. But then Cromwell received word that MPs were going down a different path. The exact path will forever be unknown, and he used the only display of sovereignty that really counted: his projection of force. Soldiers of the new model army bookended Cromwell's tirade against the MPs by manhandling them out of the Commons. The doors shut on the last scraps of the ancient Constitution of England. We've seen a lot of radical thought over the last few years of narrative. The Levellers in particular, with their powerful influence on the new model army and in London, had almost managed to push the revolution further. The Agreement of the People, the Putney debates, the Leveller mutinies, and the confusing times before and after the trial and execution of Charles I had all offered opportunities for more radical change, both politically and socially. The Diggers, with Gerard Winstanley foremost amongst them, exemplified even more radical views. The conservative reaction to these radicals, from politicians as well as from soldiers, won the struggle. The party of order triumphed over the party of movement, even if that new order was itself deeply radical compared to before the revolution. Radical politics would never go away, but increasingly they slipped into the background. But the radical energy of the English Revolution now shifted from radicalism in politics to radicalism in religion, from society to the soul. And if we jump forward to the Restoration and beyond, in many ways it was the radicalism of the soul that became the lasting legacy of the English Republic. Political changes could be wound back, a king could be restored, a republic destroyed, but there would never be religious uniformity in England again. Instead, by the time of the Restoration, England had become, in the words of one historian, a religious marketplace. Despite the efforts of the Restoration government, they would not be able to close Pandora's box, no matter how much repression they will use. Today, we're going to introduce and flesh out a few of the new radical sects of Christianity, which had flourished in the final years of the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, and which were becoming increasingly influential. Cromwell and the Army Council will replace Parliament with a new body, and many of its appointed members will follow one of these new radical religious sects. So what were they? Well, there were anti-Trinitarian Socinians, there were followers of Lodovick Muggleton, the Muggletonians, there were Seekers, there were people who saw God in nature and worshipped accordingly. There were radicals in all the major denominations who still considered themselves Orthodox Calvinists, or Presbyterians, or Lutherans, but were nevertheless preaching and publishing arguments that would never have been tolerated previously. There was even a published English translation of the Quran. But of the many that were self-defined, and those who were labelled by their enemies, we're going to look at just 4 of the most influential, or infamous. We've introduced 2 already, the Quakers and the Baptists, but only briefly. Both sects will be quite successful in the long term. The other 2 had much shorter shelf lives, the Ranters and the Fifth Monarchists. As always, I'm not a theologian, so I won't be going into the nitty-gritty of doctrine, but all 4 sects will play their role in the future narrative. Some for a long time, others less. We'll start with the Baptists. The Baptists emerged long before the Civil War, but they had grown significantly in influence and membership by this point in time. Baptists were a common sect in the new model army, especially among the officers, but the Baptists of this period were far from unified, even at this early stage of their theological career. Besides opposition to tithes and their shared belief that infant baptism was illegitimate, an infant could not understand a commitment to God, and baptism of believing adults was the only authentic form, but besides this, they had very different outlooks. The General Baptists, like the leveller Richard Overton, believed that salvation was available to anyone through good works, rejecting predestination and supporting religious toleration. The Particular Baptists, also known as Calvinist Baptists or Reformed Baptists, followed a much harder line, as we mentioned in our Irish episodes. Predestination was taken as fact, and they were among the elect, those predestined for salvation. They knew that they were literally holier than thou. In the 1650s, there were 5 associations of Particular Baptists, who met regularly to discuss theology and ideology, marriages and baptisms, and provide mutual support. These were the Western, Midland, and Berkshire associations in England, an association for Wales, and one for Ireland. Baptist congregations sent representatives, called messengers, to these associations to put their particular view forward, and of course, their views were always backed up by reference to the Bible. Like the Baptists, the Quakers appeared in our episodes on Cromwellian Ireland, but they were growing in influence in Wales and England too. The Quakers, called such by their enemies of course, were more prophets than intellectuals. Generally speaking, Quakers rejected the doctrines of original sin and predestination, to the horror of mainstream Protestantism in this period. Instead, the notion of the light within was much more important. Jesus had enlightened everyone already, and it was possible for anyone to experience the divine without the need for intermediaries. The Quakers opposed any form of national church and refused to pay tithes. To their opponents, their focus on the light within and starting up a personal correspondence with God was blasphemy of the highest order. Such an approach not only removed the role of ministers, but might even ignore the authority of the Bible. Quakerism also threatened the social order. They refused oaths and were relatively progressive in gender equality, although that is relative to the time. The founder of the Religious Society of Friends, the Quakers, was George Fox, who travelled across England, the Netherlands, and the English colonies. When he was arrested, he warned his judges to tremble at the word of God, and one of the judges then disparaged him and his followers as Quakers. The name stuck and was adopted by some friends. Before 1661, they were certainly not pacifists. They regularly disrupted and broke up other Protestant services, often with violence. Another shift in Quaker thought after the 1650s was their millenarianism, the belief that Jesus would soon return. When he rather rudely didn't, this aspect was quietly dropped. Shortly after the Restoration, Ariel Hession estimates that there were perhaps 60,000 Quakers, mostly in England and especially the north, but with friends across the English colonies and in Ireland. Both the Baptists and the Quakers would grow in popularity and influence after the Cromwellian period, but 2 other sects burned brightly in the 1650s before burning out. First up, the Ranters. There aren't a huge amount of sources we suspect were written by the Ranters themselves, especially compared to the Quakers and the Baptists, both organisations which preserved works from this period. But there are some. One is A Justification of the Mad Crew, which calls the opponents of the Mad Crew Ranters or hypocrites, but that label will quickly be turned on the crew themselves. The justifications state that, quote, "What is mine is everyone's, and what is everyone's is mine also. Every woman is my wife, my joy and delight. The earth is mine, and the beasts on 1,000 hills are mine." End quote. Another ranter tract was the Fiery Flying Roll, written by Ebenezer Copp. In this, Copp complains about the inequality within English society, and he'd be arrested for it, with his book burned by Parliament. Another ranter, Lawrence Claxton, published The Single Eye, where he explained how sin had been removed from the world by the sacrifice of Jesus. It was only used now as a means of the rich and powerful to control the poor and powerless. The intent, not the action, was what mattered. How could love or pleasure be considered a sin in God's eyes? Claxton put these beliefs into practice and was notoriously promiscuous. He also rejected the validity of any of the 10 Commandments except "Thou shalt not kill." Ranters were pantheistic. God was in everything and everyone, and so everything and everyone must be shared. Humanity had no special privilege above any other of God's creatures, great or small, and likewise no man or woman had any greater privilege over another. But what really made the Ranters stand out from the radical crowd was how they put these beliefs into practice, or how their enemies accused them of doing so. Ranters were known to sleep with each other, regardless of their marital status, ignoring any social or legal prescriptions against adultery or premarital sex. There was a point in time where some historians questioned whether the Ranters even existed. They seemed to almost be a stereotype, perfectly designed to whip up conservative outrage in revolutionary England, the realization of the worst excesses of a world turned upside down. A group that could be tied to other radical groups like the Levellers or the Diggers or Quakers and drag them down by association. Defining Rantism can be very difficult, not only because a lot of what was written about them was by their enemies, but also because it's possible that texts claiming to represent Ranter beliefs could easily have been written by people trying to make them look bad. One of those figures, eager to distance himself and his movement from the Ranters, was Gerard Winstanley, the major figure among the Diggers. His flavour of radicalism was already unpalatable to conservatives and even moderates, and the last thing he wanted was for his communities to be associated with the Ranters. But a comparison has been made between them. In a way, the Diggers and the Ranters were two sides of the same coin, with the Diggers representing the extreme revolutionary flavour in rural communities, and the Ranters doing the same for urban radicals. Nevertheless, Winstanley's pamphlets are some of the earliest examples of turning ranting and ranter against these radicals amongst radicals. From then on, ranting, ranter, and rantism are railed against in sermons, pamphlets, and newsletters from all across the political spectrum and all across England. The tales are extreme and lurid, and many are surely invented or exaggerated. One such pamphlet describes how a ranter woman gave birth to a horrible monster, the reward for her sinful lifestyle. There's no evidence of that, obviously, but it doesn't seem to have been based on an actual birth either, just invented out of whole cloth. Individual ranters like Cobb have been identified and associated with the movement, but as Ariel Hassayan notes, defining rantism was a, quote, contentious exercise. There was, and is, no agreed definition. Furthermore, not all contemporary ascriptions should be accepted. On the one hand, there was lumping. Uninformed polemicists tended to invent, exaggerate, and conflate for self-serving ends. On the other, an impulse for splitting. Former co-religionists and opponents within the same milieu were anxious to disassociate themselves from the Ranters by accentuating doctrinal and behavioural differences. End quote. To quote from him again, the Ranters were generally demonised as a lustful, ungodly crew given to all manner of wickedness. Their allegedly lascivious habits and sinful theatrical antics, cursing, excessive drinking, revelling, roaring, smoking, whoring, and parodying of religious ceremonies were envisaged as a threat to patriarchal norms and societal order. Their teachings, denounced by Presbyterian moralists, and scandalized former co-religionists alike as detestable doctrines inspired by the devil. End quote. The Ranters did not last long. Some historians date their emergence to 1649, their peak in 1650, and then their splintering from 1651, as the authorities ruthlessly repressed these dangerous maniacs. Ranters went their own way, or found new homes among other, less vilified sects. Claxton, for example, joined the Muggletonians, much to the horror of many of them who wanted nothing to do with him. But the most influential, if unsuccessful, of the short-lived sects of revolutionary England were the Fifth Monarchists. The Fifth Monarchists were a fanatical sect of radical Protestants who believed not only that the second coming of Christ was on the way, but it was coming soon, as in months or years away. It had been foretold in the Bible, after all, and all the signs appeared to be there. Fifth Monarchists wanted to prepare the world for his return, starting with England. They get their name, Fifth Monarchists or Fifth Monarchy men, because the kingdom of Christ on earth was described in the Bible as the fifth monarchy after the empires of Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. Though the Roman Empire had not been present in Britain for more than a millennium, and Constantinople had fallen to the Ottomans 2 centuries before, that was not the only Rome. There was a clear continuation in the understandings of Fifth Monarchist prophecy that Rome was represented by the Roman Catholic Church and the Bishop of Rome. The Reformation had overthrown the Pope's kingdom, and now the Fifth Monarchy of Jesus was right on the horizon. But, you might be thinking, the Reformation was more than a century old at this point. Why now? Why did Fifth Monarchism explode into relevance in the 1650s? It's time to talk about prophecy. In the book of Daniel, his vision of 4 beasts corresponds to 4 kingdoms. The 4th beast, representing Rome, had 10 horns, which were seen to represent 10 kings. Before the 4th beast was destroyed, 3 of its horns were prophesied to be broken by a little horn. Which king happened to rule over 3 kingdoms at once? Oh, that would be Charles I, King of England, Ireland, and Scotland. So that must make the little horn Parliament? Or the New Model Army? Or perhaps Oliver Cromwell? Any of them worked at first, because one had led another to conquer all 3 kingdoms on the orders of Parliament. But the Fifth Monarchists didn't justify their positions on such vague similarities. That would be ridiculous. No, they'd done the maths. Making calculations from the Book of Revelations, they worked out that the beast, Satan, or his Antichrist puppet the Pope, would rule the world for 1,260 days, which really meant 1,260 years. They dated the start of his rule from 396 AD, marking it as the end of paganism. So, 396 plus 1,260 put the year of Christ's return at, oh good heavens, 1656. That's very close to hand. Wow, what a coincidence. I'm probably poking too much fun at the Fifth Monarchists, because they really did sincerely believe this. But there were many predictions and prophecies like this, stretching back centuries earlier and into the modern day, all predicting a date close enough at hand to keep people enthusiastic. After all, if the end of days is coming, and you consider yourself saved, you want to see it. And after the social and religious upheaval of the revolutions and the civil wars, not to mention the regicide, proclamation of the Republic, it all did lend itself to apocalyptic sentiment. Maybe all the bloodshed and suffering had a greater meaning. Maybe it was necessary to herald the rule of the saints. But it was one thing to believe that the return of Christ was close at hand. That was a widespread belief across the various divisions of Christianity. Fifth Monarchists took it further, though, by striving to prepare the ground for his imminent arrival. Among their number was Colonel Thomas Harrison, one of the most influential officers in the New Model Army. He had very clear ideas for how to prepare, and in the aftermath of the dissolution of the Rump Parliament, he will try and persuade Cromwell to follow his path. Next time, we'll see whether Harrison and the Fifth Monarchists get the chance, as a replacement for the Rump Parliament is assembled from men nominated by the army. A nominated assembly, if you will. But it's much better known by one of its members. Praise God, Barban. Thank you to my House of Lords, in particular the King's favourites, Mike Sanders and Fernando Lopez Ojeda, the Duke of Portland, Damien, the Marquess of Arbroath, Stefan Mensikov, and the Earl of Dunbar, Angus Wilson. Go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica to join their ranks and listen to the podcast without ads. Remember that you can join the mailing list to get news about the show by going to the link in the description. For other great podcasts on the Airwave Network, check out airwavemedia.com. Thank you to Sounds Like an Earful for the interval music in today's episode, to my entire House of Lords, and to you for listening.